procedure-oriented programming. Now, before we go through drawbacks of procedure-oriented programming, let me show you one sample of procedure-oriented programming. For example, C program. Typically, this is the way you code in C. Volume of application may be large. So here, I have first defined three functions: add, modify, and delete. And in add, modify, and delete, we have respective code. Code to add, code to modify, code to delete. And then in main function, menu-driven code would be there, do while loop. Please enter your choice. If choice is 1, we will call add. If choice is 2, we will call modify. If choice is 3, we will call delete. So this is the way you write procedure-oriented programming. And now in this code, you can see that code is given, code. What about data? What about variables? Yes, we need variables. So in that case, some variables, we will have it in each and every function. Some variables, we will have it in each and every functions. Since those variables are there in each and every functions, those variables are called as local variables. Local variables. Whereas we need some variables common to all functions. Now see here, A is not available for modify and delete because A is defined inside add. So it's local variable. Local variable is the variable which is available only to that function. Similarly, C is not available to add and delete. It's available to modify only because it is local variable. So when you define functions, you have local variable or variables based on the requirement. But sometimes you need some variable or variables which should be common to all the functions. So those variables you define above all the methods. And such variables are called as global variables. Global variables. Now, this counter is defined outside of all the functions. That means this counter is available to all the functions, add, modify, delete, and also main. So in procedure-oriented programming, basically you write functions to accomplish a particular task. You write functions to accomplish a particular task. And those functions you call from main with the menu-driven code. What about data? Yes, you need data. So some data, they are defined inside function and they are called as local variables. Whereas some data, they are defined outside of all the functions, they are called as global variables. So this is the typical structure of procedure-oriented programming. I have taken example C because C is the very, very basic programming language. One more reason why this is called as procedure-oriented programming, because here you write number of functions. Whenever any task is given to you, you divide that task in the form of functions. You just sit together with your group and you decide, okay, this task is given. So let us write 5 functions, 10 functions, 15 functions. And those all functions you define and then you call from main function. So this is the structure of your procedure-oriented programming. This is your procedure-oriented programming. I will say procedure-oriented approach. That's it. I mean, whatever is the requirement, whatever is the volume of application, small or large, your basic structure remains the same thing. You write number of functions and those all functions you call from main. So we have oops for Java, drawbacks of procedure-oriented programming. Procedure-oriented programming approach. Okay. So, drawbacks of procedure-oriented programming. Procedure-oriented programming gives importance to functions rather than data. As I said, suppose you are a programmer for procedure-oriented programming, say for example C programming. You have a team. Suppose you have a team of 5 members and a client gives you some requirement. What you do is you sit with your group. As a developer, you sit with your group, or maybe as a team leader, you sit with your group and you discuss with the group that this requirement has been given. How should we go ahead about it, being a procedure-oriented programmer? So then you come to the conclusion that you have to write, say, 5 functions or 10 functions, and you write the functions. Maybe you divide. One person will write one function, other person will write other function. And then you gather all those functions and try to call those functions from main function. That is all about procedure-oriented programming. So gives importance to functions rather than data. Here data is not important. Here functions are important. Tasks will be divided into number of functions. Data is there. Data is required, of course. Without data, you can't write the code. And as I discussed with you, data can be either local or global. So gives importance to functions rather than data. Whenever any task is given, developers try to divide it into number of functions. As a procedure-oriented programmer, you just know one thing. Whatever may be the task, small or large, once the task is given, you finalize what methods and how many methods, how many functions, what functions and how many functions you write. I'm saying functions, I'm not saying methods, because this is procedure-oriented programming. In procedure-oriented programming, what terminology you use is functions and not methods. In object-oriented programming, you use methods, functions, member functions, etc. So gives importance to functions rather than data. Whenever any task is given, developers try to divide it into number of functions. Data can be global or local. As I said, if you realize that a particular data needs to be there only in that function, it shouldn't be accessible to other functions, so you make that data local. On the other hand, if you realize that a particular data needs to be there in all the functions, it should be common, shared by all the functions, you make that data global. So data can be global or local. Global data can be accessed or even altered by all the functions. Hence, there is no data security. Okay, now here we need to take a pause. There's a reason why I need to take a pause. The thing is that as long as you are using procedure-oriented programming, like C programming, you always say that, oh, global variables, global, what a fantastic feature we have, global, so that we can define that data and access from anywhere, no restrictions at all, complete freedom. Yes, but then you do realize is drawback. Of course, advantages you can access from anywhere, no restriction. But a coin has got two sides of it. So here one side is advantage, you can access from anywhere, no restriction. But the other side of the coin is no data security. Imagine you have a global variable like this, the way we have written here. And then you have, say, 20 functions, 25 functions, because the volume of application is large. So 25 functions.
Sorry, your voice is breaking. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Voice is breaking.
Yeah. Am I not audible properly?
You are, sir.
You are, sir.
You are, sir.
You are, sir.
So yes, sir.
Might be your internet issue.
Now.
Maybe internet issue, yeah. So, yeah. So, we have a global variable, and let's say we have 25 functions. Our program is working fine that way, but then suddenly we need to review our global variable. What about variable? What is the status of that global variable? In which function it has changed? Suppose in function number 4 it was 10, so function number 15 it became 4, function number 20 it became 20. How it happened? Step by step. So that will be tedious. In a large application, it becomes tedious to keep a track of that global variable. When it changed, how many times it changed. That is a drawback of global variable. There is no data security. Any function can modify that data. Any function can modify that data. That is one drawback. No data security of procedure-oriented programming. When the volume of application becomes large, it is very difficult to maintain the code. It's not that you can't maintain, it's not possible. It's quite possible, but it's difficult to maintain that code. Second drawback, first drawback, no data security. Second drawback of procedure-oriented programming, doesn't model real-world problems very well. Doesn't model real-world problems. Now try to understand real-world problems. What do you mean by real-world problems? They are called as real-world problems or entities. What are they? They are, let's say, student, company, account, vehicle, etc. These are called as real world problems or entities. So drawback of procedure oriented programming says that procedure oriented programming does not model real world problems very well. Very well means it does model real world problems to some extent. Yes, it is true. Now I would like to give you one example of C programming. You need not know C programming for that, just an example. Just now I showed you how do you write code in C programming. You have functions, number of functions, and those functions you call from main function, because main is a function from where execution begins. So from main you call all these functions, local data, global data, everything we have discussed. Okay, this is true when you have some task to be performed, a pure task to be performed, add, modify, delete, you want to perform. So this is okay. But suppose you are a C programmer. You are a C programmer. I mean, you are a programmer for procedure oriented programming. And client comes to you and client gives you requirement that please design student for me, because I'm from educational institute, some educational institute, so please design student for me. Now please design student for me, can you define straight away function? No. Do we have any way to define student? Student is a real world entity or real world problem. So do we have any way to define student in C? Yes. How exactly? We can go for structure student, and in that we will write character, name. Now here data type is not important, so don't pay attention to data type, or syntax is also not important. Character, name, int, age. Okay, so there is some feature called as structure in C programming, which allows us to define real world problems. But then why, what do you mean by this statement? Doesn't model real world problems very well. So this structure means, the meaning of this structure means C programming, procedure oriented programming, allows us to model real world entity to some extent. But why not complete extent? Because you have written name and age. Okay, you have written name and age. After that, you would like to provide some functionality like get name, set age, get age, functionality. Get name to read the name, set age to change his age, and get age to read age. So structure when we define with name and age, that means student has got name and age. This is not sufficient. We need some functionality also, like get name. Anytime we would like to read the name, we would like to read his age, we would like to change his age, like that. How can we define that functionality? Now you might say, okay, we can define functions in C the way we can see here, add, modify, delete. But the thing is that those add, modify, delete are global functions. And here we don't need global functions. Here we need functions specially for student only. especially for student only. So that's not possible. We can't define functions inside C structure. We can't write this functionality inside this structure. So we can define structure which matches with the real life entity. Student has got name and age. So here also we have name, age. So this structure matches with the real life entity, but to a certain level, to a certain extent, not a complete extent. Why not complete extent? Because obviously we need functionality like read name, read age, change age, and so on. That functionality we cannot define inside structure of C programming. So that's why it is said that does not model real world problems very well. It does model real world problems to some extent, but not to complete extent. So there are two main we give importance to functions. It was procedure-oriented programming because we give importance to functions. That's why procedure-oriented programming. And now object-oriented programming. Vast difference. What is that? It refers to software design in which programmers define not only data, look at that bold data for a data structure, but also types of operations. Operations, functions, procedures, all are same. Operations or functions that can be applied to the data. So this is a perfect definition of object-oriented programming. It allows you to define a data structure where you can not only define data, data is there, of course, important, but also functions, operations which can be performed on that data. So the example which I was discussing in our procedure-oriented programming, this is data, name and age. Okay, this is data. Whereas get name, set age, get age are operations which can be performed on that data. How come? Get name will read the name, get age will read age, and set age will change age. It's very simple. Get means to read and set means to change. So, you know, I said that in C programming, it allows you to define structure. So that way you can define real life entity or real world entity with the data. But operations you cannot write in C. Operations you cannot write in that structure in C. But object-oriented programming, which is not C programming, object-oriented programming refers to software design in which programmers define not only data, once again data for a data structure, but also operations that can be applied to the data. So a typical object you can imagine like this. One object, let's say student. This is one object. You can imagine this object as the combination of data and the operations. Which can operate on that data. These operations can operate on the same data, get name, set name, get age, etc. And suppose we have one more object, some different object, let's say course. Course. This is another object. Again, here also we have combination of data
सर का फिर से लैग हो गया क्या?
हाँ,
मैम तो बोल रही थी सर ने 3-4 वाईफाई लगाए थे.
रोहन तू पढ़ाना चालू कर.
Okay. So object-oriented programming refers to software design in which programmers define not only data for a data structure, but also types of operations that can be applied to the data. Operations which can be applied to the data. So for example, you can see here, suppose we are writing software for educational institute. In that case, we'll be needing some objects like student, course, employee, module, etc. So you can see this object student has got data and operations which can be performed on that data. So object-oriented programming refers to the program design which allows us to define data structure in such a way that data will be there and operations which can be performed on that data also will be there. So it's a combination of data and operations which can be performed on that data. Similarly, we need some different object like course. Again, the same story. It will have data and operations which can be performed on that data. While designing these objects, we have to take care, or we always take care, that this data will be private. Meaning what? Students' data cannot be accessible to course and vice versa. Course data cannot be accessible by student. Students' data cannot be accessible to course and vice versa. Course data will not be accessible to student. So this is what object-oriented programming means. So if you compare procedure-oriented programming and object-oriented programming,
लैग हुआ क्या रे?
Yes.
हाँ हो गया फिर से.
नमस्ते.